Is this space okay?
Yep.
Awesome.
I can go to almost any space. Okay, hi. For those of you who didn't hear, and I guess for the recording audience, my name is Rich Peterson. I am Dominic's dad. And I'm here to talk a little bit about painting today, in particular Florentine Renaissance painting. So I do know that you guys are studying the Renaissance. How far have you gotten? I mean, it's not far at all?
No.
So do you have an idea of when it starts?
1300s, yeah.
1300s? Okay. It's kind of a nebulous area. And are you, what country does it really start in? Italy. Italy is the beginning and the ending of the Renaissance. There are other countries that have it. France experiences a Renaissance. But Italy is the primary driver of the Renaissance. And in particular, it's the driver of intellectual thought in the Renaissance. And you can't talk about the Renaissance without talking about the politics, or you can't talk about the art of the Renaissance unless you're talking about the politics of the Renaissance. And you can't talk about the politics of the Renaissance unless you're talking about the church. The church, the Catholic Church in particular, is a primary mover and shaker, or is the primary mover and shaker throughout Italy, and ultimately throughout all of Europe. One of the reasons why I state that is a lot of the paintings that we see are paintings that are specific to Catholic stories, Catholic allegories. So if you have questions about them, then certainly I would encourage you to raise your hand and ask it any time. If you guys are observing the Day of Silence, please feel free to just go ahead and write down your question and raise your hand, and I'll come in and grab it. I guess the first question I have is, can you guys name, beyond Leonardo da Vinci, can you guys name an actual artist from the Renaissance? And I say beyond Leonardo da Vinci because his name's there. Yes?
Michelangelo, right?
Yes, Michelangelo. Yeah.
Raphael.
Raphael. Can I get one more? Okay.
Ninja Turtles.
So the cool thing about the Renaissance, oops, wrong way, is you can't have the Ninja Turtles unless you have the Renaissance.
Isn't there like Donatello?
Donatello. He's a famous sculptor. So each one of these four turtles here, more or less, they change the way we think of the physical world. Michelangelo, Leonardo, Donatello, Raphael. They changed how we view painting. They changed how we view art. So I get a little bit excited because they changed how we view humans. So sometimes, or humanity. The way people are portrayed now, you could not have been able to portray them in painting prior to these individuals. Can you all tell me who this, yes?
Mona Lisa.
Mona Lisa, and who painted it? Leonardo da Vinci. So I'd like you guys to take a moment and look at the painting and think about it and write down some initial thoughts that you have. Everybody knows about the Mona Lisa, but let's look at it for a moment and talk about why it's important. But I'd like you to look and write down some of your initial observations. I'm going to try not to keep walking back and forth in front of the screen, but I probably will. Okay, so who has, yeah, I'm sorry, what's your name?
Cecilia.
Cecilia, if you raise your hand, please let me know your name so I can address you by your name.
Well, it's three-dimensional. It's not like flat.
It's three-dimensional? Yeah,
Okay.
that's good. Because, and we'll see in a few minutes, three-dimensional painting didn't exist 200 years before. So it's something else that you guys see about it. Yes?
I'm Lilith, and I see that there's really a lot of dull colors. There's not a lot of...
Yeah. So Yes, go ahead.
I'm Ava. I see that there's a lot of shading, like, going on and on her body, particularly from the head and the neck.
I'm Harlan, and I think it looks more realistic because of like the shading and the perspective in the background.
Yeah. So, and I'm going to try not to go off on too many tangents. What makes this painting so unique is what you guys hit on the head. Rather than vibrant colors that other artists like Michelangelo and Raphael and Fra Bartolomeo that they're using, this is the first time that somebody really uses dark to change shading. It's a technique that's called sfumato. So they use dark paint rather than light paint to make things lighter. He uses things to make it darker. And that's one of the most important things about this particular painting. But before we get there, we come from art like this. This is a typical frieze that you're going to see in Rome. This is during late antiquity. Who knows when Rome fell for the final time? I know that was kind of out of nowhere. But without the fall of Rome, there's no point in having a rebirth, right? Renaissance means rebirth. It's a rebirth of classical education. They're learning about Greek and Latin authors and thinkers, and it's an exciting time. And it's an awakening. They've just come out of 800 years of nothingness. They've literally been in the wilderness. And that includes art. So as you guys can see with this, it's a flat panel. Right? There isn't a lot of expression. Maybe in the back you can't see it as well. But they're not dynamic. They're all just kind of there. They're just hanging out. And there's no perspective. Someone, I don't remember who was talking about how there's depth and three-dimensionality. Was that you? There's no real perspective. They're all on the same plane. So that doesn't start to change until you get to the Renaissance. This is Donatello. Well, actually, this is a work done by Donatello. It's St. Mark, and it's at a chapel called Or San Michele. Okay, so if you remember how it looked before, they're all on a flat panel. There's no movement. There's no nothing. Now they're able to add movement, and it seems small for us. We're used to seeing statues where there's dynamic, people are moving and hair is waving. This represents a sea change in terms of sculpture. For the first time, someone is actually accurately portrayed. They are able to get three-dimensionality because it's an actual statue that's kind of cloistered. You can see all the way around. As you can see depth, movement by his knees kind of bent. They didn't do this up until Donatello came along. They didn't know how to do this. And it seems kind of silly now to think about it, but it was a remarkable achievement. You can see that he has expression, a real expression. He's thinking, he's pensive. He wants to reach out, he wants to talk to you and relay an idea to you. So these are all, again, I get excited and I apologize. But there's nothing like it before. They have just really gone 1,000 years without any real art. And so then Donatello comes on the scene and he does this. This is the first piece that Donatello really does that makes everything stand out. This is actually one of my favorite painters. And this is the start of the Italian Renaissance. This is done by Giotto. It's called St. Francis and the Stigmata. Is everyone familiar with the stigmata is?
No.
Or is anyone familiar with what a stigmata is?
No idea.
Okay. So the stigmata represents the wounds that Christ had when he was crucified. So as you can see, here's the angel. And this is St. Francis. Do you guys know who St. Francis is? St. Francis of Assisi?
No.
Okay, so St. Francis of Assisi was a rich man who threw off, he forsook everything he owned. And he devoted himself to poverty and helping people, and in particular, oddly enough, helping animals. So St. Francis of Assisi is also the patron saint of animals. So you see his medallions around a little bit. But when they take their orders, when they become saints, they get the same wounds that Christ did. So in both hands, often in the side, as well as both feet. So the side is where Christ was sliced open by a Roman spear, and then the hands are where he was crucified, and then the feet. So this is kind of a big deal. But what's interesting about this is just the very beginning of any type of three-dimensionality. Think about this compared to the Mona Lisa. Right? The Mona Lisa, there was real depth. There was there was perspective, is another way to put the three-dimensionality. Here, everything really is on the same plane. It's hard to tell that St. Francis isn't quite on the same plane as the house, as the angel. It's all there. His face, what's unique about this, though, is his face. And I know it's hard to see from far away, but his face is showing emotion and expression. So remember what the Leonardo quote is. There's only two things worth painting: man and the intentions of his soul. This is the first time that an artist, in kind of recorded real artist, attempts to show man's soul, who he is as a person. And it's a light year away from where they were, from the Byzantine works of art. But it still has some of the Byzantine qualities in that there's a lot of gold floating around. But this is the start of the Italian Renaissance. It's the start of at least the artistic part of the Renaissance. How many of you are familiar with this painting? You guys know who painted it? Okay, it's by a guy named Botticelli. Right, so this was done in the late 15th century, I think 1493 to be exact. So compare this to this, right? And we can see just how far we start to come. There are vibrant colors, there's depth, there's perspective, there's movement in a way that you don't see beforehand. What is absolutely amazing about this is the first major piece of art that doesn't have a Christian bent to it. Do you guys know what this is called? Yes?
I don't know what it's called, but it's Greek god Aphrodite.
Yes. It's it's Venus in the half shell, but it's the same person. Yes, it's Aphrodite. It's the birth of Aphrodite. Right? So now we're taking a lot of the classical ideas and philosophies that have been coming about, and we're starting to incorporate them in painting. Because up until now, for the most part, everything is commissioned by the church or the Domiticis, and the Domiticis were kind of part of the church. Yeah?
Because Venus is the Roman version of Aphrodite.
Yes.
Okay. I was just...
No, that's okay. Ask away. If you guys have questions, ask. I mean, please stop me, because I like the sound of my own voice, but I can't imagine that you do as much. And I was a classicist first, so we can talk for hours about Greek mythology, but you probably don't want to.
Yay!
Yeah, I know, it's cool, right?
Death.
But I mean, this is important. This is another game changer. For the first time, we have a major work of art that isn't commissioned by the church, that isn't telling a church allegory. It's talking about the birth of sex and love, right? Because that's who Aphrodite is.
Goddess of beauty.
She's the goddess of beauty. She's also the goddess of love, right? So it's more than just love, which is kind of one reason why this is so shocking, and it's important to have that background. It's not just love, it's erotic love, it's passion, it's lust, it's all of those things. And now you're putting it up in a place that no one's used to seeing it. So imagine you're trying to shock your parents. You're probably not going to put that up there. But imagine trying to shock your parents. Think of how far you're willing to push the envelope. And that's close to what this is. This is what is called as a deposition. And I believe this is Raphael. I think that was the Raphael that I put in here. And this is a little bit later, Then Botticelli, it's the early 15th century. So I'm going to assume that I already know the answer to this. Who knows what a deposition is? Or what the term means? The deposition is when Mary and the disciples take the body of Christ down and they start to dress him and wrap him up in this burial clothes. Okay? So there are certain pieces that come up time and time and time again. One of those it's called a pietà. It's a mother and child. We're going to see a little bit of that soon. The other is a deposition. Both of those are common stories that are frequently told. But this is Raphael. Now think about how the Mona Lisa looked. It was a little bit darker, right? He was using darks and he was kind of experimenting with shading. And well, here we still have shading. Here we still have major dynamic movement, but it's colorful. He's using color. It's completely, yeah.
One thing you notice about this painting is everyone looks very dramatic.
Yes. So, and that's awesome because Raphael leads right into what's called high mannerism, which is at the end of the Renaissance. But it's a type of painting where emotions are exaggerated. So that's a really good point. They're in agony because they're taking their Messiah down from the cross. It's very real. And one of the ways that he's able to just not paint the agony, he's able to paint movement, is you see there's kind of a V shape, and that creates a tension within the painting. And there's the orthogonals are what the V's are often called, and so you'll see a series of them, and they're a geometric way to kind of build that perspective into a painting. But again, think about the Giotto. You had a very staid St. Francis who's just kind of hanging out, waiting to be sliced by the angel. But here, again, people are emotional. You can see the sadness on their face. They're not all necessarily looking in the same direction, and there's movement. So this is Raphael and the deposition. This is one of the older Mary and Child. This is a typical piece that you're going to see from the Middle Ages. In particular, Byzantine. When we talk about art throughout the Middle Ages, we're talking mostly about Byzantium or Constantinople. You guys know where Constantinople is?
Yes.
Or what it is today?
Istanbul.
Istanbul? Okay, you guys know they might be giants? Or are you still too young?
Oh, I know it's
Yeah. So Constantinople is named after Constantine the emperor. He's the one who really brought Christianity, who turned Christianity into a political force by giving it Rome's okay. What he also did is he split the empire into two. The Holy Roman Empire, the Roman Empire at that time, it was too large. And so half of it stayed in Rome and the other half, the eastern half, was in Constantinople. And so all of culture, really, after the fall of Rome in 476 AD, moved east, and it moved to Constantinople. And this is the type of painting. And I'm showing this to you because in a minute we're going to see a completely different type of painting. Again, she kind of has an expression, but mostly she just looks like her teacher's been talking too long, right? The baby's reaching up, but there's nothing there. There's no movement. There's no real connection between mother and child. And this is baby Jesus and his mom, and there should be something there. And there's not. I'm showing that to you so that you can see this. This is Michelangelo. Look at the difference between what Michelangelo did and what they were doing 1,000 years before. I mean, it's just, there's color, it's vibrant, there's movement, there's affection. What's also amazing about Michelangelo is his ability to accurately portray how humans look. Right? You can actually see muscles in her arms. In fact, there's, people kind of go back and forth because she looks a little manly because she's got the muscles, but really, this is how people look. People have muscles. People have sinew. People have emotions. So his ability to create this connection between the mother and the child and the father, and so this is commonly referred to as the don di tondo, but it's mother and child. So you can see the difference between Michelangelo and what came before him. This is the drawing of Saint Anne, or this is the fully painted Saint Anne with Mary and child. This is Leonardo again. So do you guys kind of see the same thing between Leonardo and, between this piece and the Mona Lisa?
Yeah.
Right? You have the same, you still have that kind of wistful smile, but it's darker, and it's in shadows, and it's shaded. So one of the things that I love about this particular period is the race between Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. It's a race to be the best, and each one is constantly trying to top the other. This was done a couple years after the Doni Tondo, but there was a drawing that preceded it that was just black and white, and it was literally shades of gray. And it came out, but it was so beautiful that people came from around the countryside to come and see the drawing of St. Anne, which eventually turned into this painting. But, I mean, if you have the same expressions, you have the same idea of movement, but you have an absence of color. So as cool as, as interesting as Leonardo is, as you guys continue to explore, you're going to find that there is no successor to Leonardo da Vinci. He has none. No one can follow what he does. Perhaps nobody wants to. But his technique, his use of darks and lights, and his continued interest in painting emotion, painting the man's soul, or human soul really, is what drives him. Whereas Michelangelo is looking for technical perfection as much as he's looking for spiritual perfection. He's interested in the body. So while you have Leonardo's Vitruvian Man, have you guys all seen the diagram like that? Okay, so he's interested in the body, but not in the same way. Michelangelo used to break in and dissect cadavers so that he could see how he could see really how the human body worked. It's one of the reasons why his statue of David is so remarkable, because it is anatomically perfect. And it's one of the things that really drives his painting, aside from just the colors, that makes him unique. Are you guys familiar with Pablo Picasso? Yeah? Okay. So we go from here to here in just a few hundred years. Pablo Picasso, in his use of colors, is a direct descendant of Michelangelo. This is an early work of Picasso. And I'm putting that there because everyone knows his Cubism, but it's to show that there's this correlation. We're all trying to figure out, all artists are trying to figure out where they fit, how to do perspective. This is called the crucifixion, so it's really similar to the deposition. Even though it's not meant to have a Christian bent, you can't really talk about a crucifixion and not have that imagery. So think about what Raphael's deposition looked like. Full bodies, anguish, emotion. And then you have Picasso, who has all of that in here, but it's performed in an entirely different manner. And yet there's still that correlation. He's still going back to the basics of what they were doing. Still learning perspective. Still learning emotion. Look at how the child is looking at the dove. There's still a little bit of perspective. This is one of the earliest pieces he did. I think he was 21. So I think that's it in terms of slides. If you guys have questions,
Actually, I had a question. I was a little curious when you said competition between Michelangelo and Leonardo. Could you elaborate on that in terms of like their knowledge of each other's styles and art?
They were contemporaries. They were absolutely contemporaries. They were both painting in Florence at the same time, and later they both went to Rome at the same time. They absolutely knew who each other were. I think that the drawing of St. Anne, or the painting of St. Anne, was done around 1513, which was right around the same time Michelangelo had subsequently gone to Rome and was working on the Sistine Chapel. So they were very much aware of who each other were. And they had their own studios. And they had their own patrons. So, yeah.
So it's kind of like Edison and Tesla?
Not exactly. I mean, yes. But both Leonardo and Michelangelo, were famous in their own right, and we had to remember Tesla. But beyond that, yeah, it would be similar to that.
Do you know, are there any recorded times where they met and conversed, or?
I'm not aware of any
Okay.
offhand.
Kind of curious what they would say to each other if they were both in the same room, or if one was viewing the art of another, like,
One of the things that Leonardo really worked in, there's a term called artifice, which is related to artificial. It means exaggerated. And I think Michelangelo probably would have looked at Leonardo's work and felt that it was too heavy, too morose, too over the top. And Leonardo might have looked at Michelangelo's work and said, you're missing the essence here. They're just in their. Those are probably the two different ways. I mean, they really approached. Is Leonardo really was more concerned about the spiritual well-being of what he's painting, the spiritual. I want to say zeitgeist, but that's not what I'm going. I mean, the spiritual quality of what he was painting, versus Michelangelo, who was really focused on what was technically perfect. Yeah.
Were the Ninja Turtles created to be educational about these painters?
I don't know. Well, I mean, they're certainly inspired by the painters. I mean, you don't have the Renaissance without these four individuals. And you probably, they both moved painting forward in such a dramatic fashion that without them, there's no Ninja Turtles, right? Ultimately. You guys have questions about other parts of the Renaissance? I mean, the Renaissance it's just, the early part of the Renaissance is alive with art and culture. You have Dante writing the whole trilogy, but the Inferno and the Purgatory. You have Galileo discovering that the Earth revolves around the sun. Yeah. Blinding myself. Was Donatello alive at the same time as Michelangelo? He was a little bit before. They may have crossed paths a little bit. He was sculpting and painting in the early part of the 15th century. And I don't know quite how long he lived, but I think he was older. He was a little bit older. Okay?
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Why does that dude's work look like a collage, but like just all messed up?
Okay, so Pablo Picasso, again, he's a large topic in and of himself. This is called Cubism. So there is a movement in the early part of the 20th century away from traditional art like this. They were doing still lifes. What was preceding this beforehand was Impressionism. So are you guys familiar with the pretty flowers and the people on the lake and everyone's, so that's called, depending on your, some people like it, some people don't. So like Van Gogh, he was an Impressionist. This preceded, or came afterwards. And it was not so much in rebellion, it's just an extension of how artists were really kind of trying to push the map. So today you can go in and you look at an art installation and it looks like it's totally black, right? But there's texture within the black, and there's different blacks within the black. So artists are continually trying to push the boundaries. And this is Pablo Picasso doing it extraordinarily well, but much differently than anybody else has before him. He had a contemporary called Matisse. If you see all of these colors, Matisse was also a big fan of colors. But he didn't do cubism, he did shapes. Yeah.
Picasso's art when he was younger, it was a lot more, I would say, realistic looking, and when he got older, his like portraits and drawings got much more like distorted and unusual looking.
Yeah. That was him pushing things. Right? That's him. We talk about abstract art, and he's the beginning of abstract art. We talk, yeah.
What are the most famous art pieces of the Renaissance?
What are the most famous?
Yeah.
The Mona Lisa, without a doubt, is probably the most famous. I think if I showed the Mona, I mean, everybody here recognized the Mona Lisa, right? For the most part. So the Mona Lisa is one. The Sistine Chapel, although I would say the Sistine Chapel is something that everyone's heard of, but you couldn't necessarily pick it out of a lineup of other paintings. But in terms of importance, that would be one of them. Botticelli's the Birth of Venus that I showed is another one that's incredibly important. And then there's a lot of smaller pieces. They're frescoes that might go along on the church wall that are equally important, but they're a little harder to get pictures of. They're a little harder to see. And they're making smaller technical changes that are important, that move art forward, but aren't necessarily recognizable. But I would say for me, the Mona Lisa is probably the most recognized piece of art from the Renaissance. That and Michelangelo's David, but that's sculpture. Yeah.
Do you have any backgrounds of like these artists' lives and like what like if there were any hardships during these people's lives?
Well, so life in the 15th century in Florence was hard. Period. In terms of hardships, they had patrons, so they lived relatively well. I mean, they weren't rich, but they had their own studios and they produced artwork, and artwork was commissioned of them for them so that they could, have a life painting. But I am not familiar with any, lost a limb, overcame it by painting with his teeth kind of thing. For the most part, they led relatively normal lives that the rest of their contemporaries did. They just happened to be extraordinarily good artists.
And did Van Gogh, or whoever that was, really cut off his ear? Or part of his ear?
Yeah, he cut off the tip of his ear. He had some problems. he had some psychological problems. But what makes Van Gogh, it's a neat story, but what makes him important isn't that he cut off the tip of its ear. It's his ability to capture kind of the essence of what he saw, through stars. Yeah. Go ahead, Lilith, and then I will read.
Are there any artists today who are kind of like following the footsteps of these older artists?
So I can argue that every artist follows in the footsteps. There are some artists that are my favorites. I'm not as familiar with what's going on today as what was going on in the 80s and 90s. There's an artist named Jenny Holzer, and all she does is they're called truisms, right? So she writes statements that she says these are true, and she puts them on LED lights and panels, and they flash and they go back and forth, and they say things like, people who don't work with their hands are parasites. So she'll throw out statements, and I would argue that you could say that's a descendant of Leonardo da Vinci, because she's talking about kind of what the intentions of our soul are, right? There is another artist. He's really at the end of his life if he hasn't just died. His name is Cy Twombly. He does outstanding abstract art, which really comes from Picasso. And he uses mathematical equations in it, and there's lines. Those are two that kind of stand out, that are some of my favorites at the moment. I'm going to think about it for another second while I'm answering your question is who got to keep the paintings. The paintings were often commissioned by wealthy patrons. So they were kept by either the patrons themselves. If they were commissioned by a church, they would stay in the church. Sistine Chapel, obviously it's still hanging out in Rome, so it's not going anywhere. But a lot of art has moved around over the years. The Mona Lisa is not in Florence. It's hanging in the Louvre. The St. Francis of Assisi, the stigmata of St. Francis, that actually is in the St. Francis of Assisi Chapel. So some of the art stayed in place where it was created, especially for churches. A lot of it has been kind of transported around. World War II changed a lot.
I was going to ask, did the patron families donate them to museums or whatnot, or is it that it was confiscated during the war or stolen, or?
Well, a combination of both. So the Uffizi, I think it dates back to the mid to late 19th century. So it predates the wars, and a lot of families would create collections of work that they or other families like them have commissioned, and so they want to be able to display them. A lot of private pieces that weren't necessarily on display in museums, they really did get moved around quite a bit during the war. And just in case you guys don't know, what happened was during the mid to late 1930s, a lot of the Germans, or the Nazis, came in and they took a lot of Jewish people's artwork, which were, they had masterpieces of a number of different masterpieces, and they stole them, and they kept them for themselves, and they hid them. And I think now we're still finding small enclaves of work that was stolen during World War II.
What kinds of materials did the artists use beyond just like paint for their?
Well, so the paint as we know it, they didn't really have, right? So they used oils, and they used oil-based paint. They would still use flowers, that they so things that you're going to find naturally. They didn't have the ability to make the synthetic material that we do. They often would paint on a canvas. Sometimes they would paint on, there's a term called fresco, or there's a type of painting called fresco, so where they would use, they would color cement, basically, while it was still wet. And they would be able to create paintings out of that. But for the most part, it's what you can find in nature. So they would grind up flower petals and that kind of thing.
Okay, any last questions?
No.
Okay, let's give him a round of